The only difference in Minnesota, we have 3 foot of snow on the ground before we can start thinking about getting out there. And as Harold mentioned, he actually harassed me for a month to get a title to him, and I finally got him. About a month ago, I got him this title, and I thought it was great. And then last week, I started thinking about what I might put in such presentation. And I really had a tough time because I was translating what I was doing in Minnesota to Ohio. And I guess what I learned from it was that I spend a lot of my time working on Minnesota-specific problems, right? Which is good. That's what I'm supposed to do. I ended up working through a presentation, and I started pulling a bunch of stuff together, and I ended up with 120 slides. I thought that was probably more than you guys wanted to see today. So I shrunk it down, but this is going to be a little bit different. It's a little fractured. I'm doing a lot of things, but I'm trying to identify some things that are relevant to Ohio. A lot of what I ended up coming up with was data that's a little bit in progress, so middle of some studies. I've also got some real wide variation in some of the topics that I'm going to talk on, but I was just trying to hit on some things that would be relevant for you all. Okay. So I decided to talk about some interactions. So interactions are things that one factor might affect the response of another factor. I've got a really nice study going on right now with iron deficiency chlorosis and soybean cyst nematode. I'm going to spare you all of the iron chlorosis parts. We don't have those kinds of high pHs that we're dealing with here as we have in Minnesota. So I'm just going to touch on some of the higher points on the SCN side. I'm not a nematologist, and I don't want to step on any pathologists or Andorn's feet with this, so I'm just going to touch on some very high points from a very practical management level standpoint. I do have a study where we're looking at drainage, and I know that that's a topic that could be relevant for a lot of folks here in Ohio, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a drainage study. It's kind of unique. And again, we're just going to hit some observations from there and maybe some points to think about. Not a lot of summaries from that. I deal with, probably half of my life deals with soybean quality related issues. So I have a unique kind of a niche in soybean production, and as an agronomist, half of my life is spent on soybean quality, the other half is on production related management issues. I'm going to talk about one that kind of falls in between, and it's related to foreign material in soybean. It seems like an academic point, but I'm going to try to bring that back for you all. And if you're all well behaved, you'll get to see a little movie, okay? So maybe ask a question. By well behaved, I mean ask a question, stay awake, not too much on the phone, you get it. Okay, I don't think we'll have time to talk about environmental effects on soybean quality. But if I go really fast and I push through this really hard, we might be able to get to some of that. Okay, so IDC and SCN. We've got a problem in Minnesota with our high pH soils. We've got a lot of SCN, IDC problems in the same fields. SCN seems to be promoted in some way. We get better reproduction. We get more damage in IDC and high pH environments. We've got a study out now. We're just trying to tease out the relative impacts of those and see if there's interactions. Does the SCN drive IDC? Does IDC drive SCN? Or even is there a dampening of these things? With SCN being a parasite, maybe the SCN actually is, or IDC is holding it down. So this is one of those studies, Sean showed you, since he's not here, I can talk about Sean. Oh, Carrie's not here either, I can talk about her. So when they bail out, that gives me an opening to go ahead and talk about them. But Sean showed you a lot of pretty pictures about soybeans and being green and yields. This is one of the first studies that I've had where we can really see, you don't have to take a combine to this field to know the yield differences. We know they're there. We can create a really wide range of environments related to especially the iron chlorosis side. But again, we're going to talk on SCN. So just to close out this IDC piece, here's a relatively high resolution map of soil pH in the top foot. I believe the differentiation where it's white between the red and the hotter colors and the cooler colors, I think that's about 6.3 on this figure. you can see that Minnesota, the Dakotas, the western Corn Belt is where we have this high pH in our soils, as well as some pockets up north of here in Michigan, you know, some of these sugar beet areas in the thumb, and then a lot of interesting things along rivers, areas like that with calcareous soils. But this is mostly a Minnesota and western Corn Belt problem. These two issues, as I mentioned, overlap a lot, so we're trying to pull these things out. We do have management solutions for both of these, and we're using some of these treatments to induce levels of both IDC and SCN stress in our fields. But again, just on the SCN part. We were targeting fields that had both of these pressures. We did a good job identifying fields that had a lot of iron chlorosis. We didn't do as good a job identifying high cyst pressure. In these fields, you can see we have, most of them are above 1,000. This is six locations in the last 2 years. We're going to run another 4 or 5 locations this year to wrap up this study. So we had this kind of low to moderate pressure in these fields. This is the response that we got. So these are the varieties, groups of varieties, and they're in a little bit poor order. So we had susceptible lines with the PI 88788 background. We had Pekings in the red and the blue. So the red and the blue are with Peking. Flupyram is Elevo. We used the formulation, now I just blanked on it, but we used a formulation that's an in-furrow type formulation used for hort crops as our negative or our nematicide in this particular trial. It didn't do anything beyond the Peking for us at all, so I'm not going to talk about it. We did not add it on top of the 88788 or the susceptible background. The point here was to have a complete negative control on SCN alone. So we're just going to really talk about these first 3 lines here. We had 3 locations where we saw significant yield differences from SCN. Okay? So the question from a practical standpoint and looking back retrospectively, what could we help a producer with managing SCN in these fields based on soil test information from SCN? So we had SCN counts, as well as we did a partial HG test. So basically we're using differentials, so we use 88788 or the Peking line. And an important thing to remember is when the labs do these HG tests, they're using those exact PIs. They're using the original line in the lab. You take your soil, they grow those varieties out, those actual PIs in the lab, and they look at the level of reproduction on those relative to susceptible check in your soil. So they're looking at the population of your SCN, take it to lab, grow those varieties out, a susceptible, 88788, and then the actual Peking line, and then look at relative reproduction. These numbers here are the relative reproduction. So this first one, you can see Peking, it reproduced at 1.7% of the susceptible. So basically, that population of SCN in that particular field, the PI or the Peking is able to handle it. That population is not virulent on that particular Peking line. 8878, however, it is. So there's over 10%. The nematologists have come up with a threshold for 10%. If there's more than 10% reproduction on any of those differentials relative to the susceptible check, they identify that as a virulent population on that. That means it will reproduce on that form of resistance. Okay? So this is the question. We have populations here. We have HG types basically. So this denotes HG type 2 means that 88788 will support reproduction of SCN in this field. We had low populations, no yield response, probably related to the population here, okay? But where we did see a yield response are these 3 locations. We actually had 27 bushel yield increase when we put a Peking here relative to susceptible. About half of that for the 88788. The interesting thing to me is that this is a group, this is a HG1-2, meaning that there's this soil has populations of SCN that are virulent on both 88788 and Peking. So this would indicate that neither of these would do well for you. So if you took that soil, if this farmer would have gone to the lab, asked for an HG test, he would have probably thrown up his hands because the reproduction rate is relatively low. It's not much above 10, but it's the same for either, and he probably wouldn't have put a Peking out there. But for whatever reason, Peking did really well in this field. You look at other fields, 88788 here is just above the threshold, but yet 88788 did out-yield the susceptible in this case. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about reproduction here, and then finish this up. So this is the reproduction in these individual fields based on these varieties. So these are total egg counts by variety in the final. So you can see we had pretty good reproduction. Some of these we went up to 32,000 eggs per 100 cc's of soil for the susceptibles. So purple is susceptible. You put a susceptible line out, you get a lot of reproduction. It's kind of what we expect. The question is, how do these other lines line up with this? Final numbers don't do us a lot because they're affected by what was there initially. So what we do is we look at the difference between the final and the spring and the final egg counts in those fields, and this gives us a reproduction factor. So we're looking, a number 2 is a doubling, a number 10 is 10x increase in those. So this is what we get in those fields. You can see our susceptibles anywhere from 2 to 22 times as many SCN eggs in those fields relative to spring. But you can see we've got 88788s in some cases, also reproducing at relatively high levels, and those are those same numbers. You can look at this and justify those numbers and say, yes, those HG types support the utility of those varieties. But if you stare at those long enough, you can also identify areas where those indicators don't tell us anything about how those varieties will perform or how the SCN numbers will react. So what kind of reproduction we're going to have in the field. So to back up, there's two important pieces in managing SCN. There's yield protection, and then there's reduction of your SCN numbers in your field. So you want to be able to do both in your production fields. And there's some overlap in that these good SCN lines are going to still perform well, and they're going to help reduce SCN populations, but they're not completely independent. And part of this data shows that same thing. Okay, so the question is, why does this happen? And all of this is coming around to this point about variety selection. The point here is those differentials that determine HG types, again, are the original PIs that have all the genes that the breeders then use to put into their resistant lines. They have the full complement of SCN resistance genes, but they probably also lack some of the field level resistance genes that we have that help moderate yield loss from SCN and other factors, plus all of the other agronomic genes that go into managing that individual variety. So what we're doing is we're really looking at two sets of background genetics, those varieties versus the original varieties. Plus, there's a problem with resistant varieties in that even a variety that's labeled as resistant and has 88788 in the background may not have all of those genes in it. As that variety is brought through these breeding programs, individual genes are lost. And in fact, the 88788 background uses copy number, so multiple copies of the same gene impact how resistant that variety is. And through breeding, sometimes some of those are actually lost. We found resistant varieties that are varieties labeled that are resistant that may be partially resistant, and they may have 5 copies instead of 10 copies of that individual gene. So the point here is, again, there's a lot of discussion about whether it's an 88788 or a Peking variety. That's good. Those are good points of discussion. The problem is those varieties will perform different in different soil conditions and in different environments. I really am urging farmers to figure out a way, because I don't know how to do it, I'm putting it back on you all, to do some in-field testing of these things. This is one area where I think farmers can do a better job evaluating how their varieties are performing in these fields and monitoring performance and then monitoring SCN numbers in fields too. I think it's too much to ask to look at reproduction of individual varieties in fields because it's impossible to do the kind of testing you can in large scales. And between farms, we have environments and years and different soil types. But monitoring performance of individual varieties and taking soil tests in fields sequentially every 2 years, every 4 years, I think to monitor SCN populations will be important. So this is the integrated management of SCN that's important. I think the top lines are the most important pieces. We have to take soil tests, dig soybeans in the summer and look for SCN on the roots. If you've got SCN on the roots, that means, if you can see them, that means they're reproducing. So that variety that you have is supporting reproduction in your field. So if you dig those up, and you're all planting resistant varieties, I'm sure. So if those are still supporting reproduction, you're seeing it on the roots, you know that variety may not be, it's a good indicator that that variety may not be performing for you very well from an SCN standpoint. Non-host crops, extend that rotation. This isn't an easy one until we see a crash in soybean prices. Maybe we'll get a little bit of room here and we'll add a few more acres of corn in some of these rotations, and so we'll have a 2 and 1. This will give us some benefit, but the longer the rotations, obviously, the better. And this resistant variety piece is really critical, as I've been talking about. So find resistant varieties, evaluate how they're doing, look at how they perform in state variety trial tests. And I forgot to ask Laura how this is set up and how the varieties are tested, but I'm sure there's SCN testing going on for those varieties that you can evaluate. Nematicides on seed treatments is a possibility. These are not very good. They only infrequently perform the way they should in the field. Greg Tilka tells me about 10% of his trials, he'll see a yield response from those nematicide seed treatments in his field tests. Likewise, about 10% of the time, he'll see them perform in terms of reducing egg counts at the end of the year. And those don't necessarily go together. So these aren't a slam dunk. Even the better seed treatments aren't the answer. Some of them will work for some people. There's some really nice biologicals out there that should give us some opportunity, but there's no easy answer. And the cover crops is a challenge because we have, some of these dicots are going to be actual hosts for SCN, so we have to really watch and choose carefully. Okay. I think this is basically what I mentioned before, is we need to be able to, the key here eventually is identifying better SCN resistant varieties, and a lot of that's going to come back to the farmer. It's more than just looking at the seed catalog and seeing that it has a race 3 resistant or it's an 88788, that we have to be doing better testing ourselves. Okay? Any big questions on that?
That kind of looks like a flooded out area, though. It's not like heavy organic, the way the color is, you got some skips in there,
That's the IDC. So that's our iron chlorosis. So we can burn the crap out of these things with IDC, both varieties. And the way we manage IDC in terms of this particular study, I know this is kind of an academic point where we have lower pHs, but excess nitrates really blows up iron chlorosis. So for whatever reason, we get worse iron chlorosis where we have carryover N. So we put 150 pounds of N on and we can smoke them. On the other side, we've got good iron chelate products now. So those are widely used in Minnesota and the Dakotas, where we have known IDC pressure. Those iron products work really well for us. So we can create very easily a nice range of conditions. You can see from 0 to 60 bushels. Okay? Okay, a little bit about drainage, and again, I'm just going to give you a high-level piece on this. I'm really interested in drainage. I'm from a state that has a lot of drainage issues, as you do, in terms of production. The objective of my study, though, is different than most of what you've probably seen from drainage studies before. Most drainage studies go at it from two angles. One, they're a water quality, environmental kind of monitoring drainage study where you take pieces of fields and you manage them in certain ways and then look at the water quality coming out of those. The other type is purely engineering, where you set up fields and you look at tile depth and width. There's, separation between lines. None of those work well for agronomic research because they're not replicated. We have no way of going in and looking at how any of our management practices might work in poorly drained versus well-drained. Likewise, if we set up an agronomic type trial, it limits us on other things. But that's okay. I decided to go ahead and push forward on this. So 5 or 6 years ago, I got some funding from Minnesota Soybean to put out a trial with the focus of looking at interactions between drainage and other factors. And my overall hypothesis is that farmers are going out, they've got one prescription, they're rubber stamping all their acres, and they're just saying, I'm going to plant 145,000, I'm going to use a seed treatment, I'm going to do this. And it goes out on every one of their 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 acres, same thing everywhere. My contention is there's probably, plus farmers are farming rented ground, owned ground, they have sandy soils, they've got hilltops, they've got low peaty areas, they've got well-drained and poorly drained areas, and they're farming it the same way. My contention is there's probably things that we need to be doing different in these poorly drained areas relative to well-drained areas. So that's when I talk about interactions, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at what things affect yields differentially between well-drained and poorly drained soils from a management standpoint. Okay. So I found a farmer that was willing to work with me, gave me 17 acres to play with, so I've been on this site again for 5-6 years. I lease it, and my project runs this whole thing. We put in 8 blocks of drain tiles, and then each one of those has a drainage structure on it. 4 of those we shut off the first day right after it was tiled. So we have tile under every single plot. We have 30-foot plots, and we have 30-foot spacing. So there's a tile line under the middle of every plot and perpendicular to the rows. And then half of those are drained, half of those are undrained. So that's what the map looks like. Basically, this is plot plan for last year. It's just split corn and soybeans. It allows us, because it takes a lot of buffering and a lot of spacing, we get 45 plots basically to deal with this. So we have 45 corn plots, 45 soybean plots. I'm only interested in the soybean side, so we basically are looking, the corn is either a rotation effect or we're using the corn plots to impact our soybeans, and I'll show that in a minute. So what we did in the last couple of years is we decided to split this further. I decided to look at tillage interactions. So now we have 3 kinds of interactions. We have drainage, tillage, so we can look at the interactions between drainage and tillage. And then within each of those tillage treatments, then we can look at other things. So we have another 15 plots then we can look. So we have strip till, no till, and conventional till in each of these blocks, and you can kind of see these in this Google map image. Okay, so I'm just going to show you again. This is kind of preliminary work, but I wanted to highlight 2 years. I think it's reasonable to talk about these 2 years. 17, we had pretty good rainfall in Minnesota, but most of it was front-loaded. My data says 22 inches of rain during the growing season, and that seems a little bit light, but that's what we showed on some of our sensors. But again, most of this was front-loaded in the season. Overall, we only saw a 2 bushel yield difference between well-drained and poorly drained. And this is not uncommon for this site. And This site isn't intended to provide an overall value for drainage for everyone. This is what happens at this particular site. And really the interest that I have is that second level, is where is the interactions between drainage and other management factors. So this is 17. Again, good rainfall, but mostly early. We look at tillage. We did not see, we had an interaction by tillage, but at the tillage effect, this is what we saw here. Conventional till, we had a little bit depression of yields for no-till, and then strip till was a little bit better, kind of what you might imagine. But this is how it lined up when we looked at the actual interaction that we identified here. So basically what we identified was, as long as you either had drainage or conventional till, you could maximize yields. But when you had one or the other of those that was lacking, then you had more trouble. So in this particular instance, we were bulletproof in drained. We could do anything we wanted. We had same yield levels. We only ran into trouble in terms of yields when we were trying to no-till under poorly drained conditions. Makes some sense with a little bit of a cool or a wet spring. Okay, here's our management factors. So again, I'm trying to pick off some of these top management factors that might interact with drainage. And you'll see that overall there's not a lot to say. There's not as many interactions as we really expected. This is some of the commonly thought of issues that we might see. So we have seed treatments in the first four. So untreated, fungicide seed treatment, insecticide seed treatment, fungicide plus insecticide, so no yield difference. This is 17. We put a foliar fungicide at this site, and we get a yield response on top. For whatever reason, we get a foliar fungicide response at this site, but we don't see an interaction with drainage, we don't see an interaction with tillage. So whatever it is about this environment promotes the value of foliar fungicides, and these are not, I don't see this response anywhere else in any of my other research in Minnesota. I'm not a proponent of foliar fungicides, but this particular site seems to respond well. We put 120 pounds of N on just to see if we had if this site was somewhat nitrogen responsive, and we got a small, obviously not economical yield response, but we get a nitrogen response at this site on soybeans. So again, two things that I don't see anywhere else, but for whatever reason we see it here. This year was different. This year we had too much rain. It was 26, 27 inches of rain, but it was almost all on the back side. So this was August and September primarily. Too much rain later, and you can see the effect of that. We had a much larger overall yield effect in terms of the response. We had 12 bushel yield response, drained versus undrained. So this is very unusual. I had several years before where we didn't see anything, so to see a 12 bushel response is pretty significant. Here's our tillage, and there's actually no interactions found at all for tillage. We saw that same level of depression of yield, but again, the rainfall patterns this year were more towards the backside. So the tillage piece is going to be more important interactions with drainage on the spring side where we have wet soil conditions. It's a little like what you'd expect, but this is just some data that would support that. Okay, here I actually have the products down, and I'm sorry we kind of ran out of room and I had to crunch it, but those are the same seed treatments. So we had untreated foliar, or we had untreated seed, fungicide, insecticide, fungicide plus insecticide, fungicide, insecticide plus a foliar fungicide at R3, and we got that same kind of response. So again, the same type of thing. So what we're doing now with these plots, over the last 2 years, we've initiated a program where we're looking at corn management effects on soybeans. So this is something that I've been dabbling around the edges with for a long time. And part of it's just out of my own frustration with my inability to affect soybean yields as a soybean agronomist. And somebody that only works on soybean, I'm frustrated that I can't do more. But through a number of anecdotal things, based on rotational studies, based on some kind of preliminary work that we've done on corn management studies where we follow those with soybeans, we've noted, or I've noted, that there's a lot of instances where we see carryover effects into our soybean yields that are as great as what we can do in the soybean year itself. So I'm working with Fabian Fernandez. He is a corn, he's primarily a nitrogen specialist, fertility specialist on University of Minnesota. And we're looking at N rates on corn and timing and the carryover effects on soybeans, okay? So that's what we have here. All of these numbers here are the N rates on the previous corn crop. You can see we got basically nothing. We had one treatment where we reduced yields. Very well, could be an anomaly. It is kind of an interesting treatment. It was with a pre-plant, it was a full 200 pounds of N with a split. There may be something about that timing that actually affects our soybeans, but this could simply be just an outlier. We did again see this response to soybean at this particular site. But, again, the important factor here is how do these interact with drainage and tillage? And we're not seeing that interaction here. So we're seeing some main effects from these individual treatments, but not interaction. So tillage is not affecting this response, nor is drainage affecting this particular response. Okay? So we're going to continue on this and look at this a little bit more. Any questions on this drainage stuff? All right, we're hauling through this. This is good. You're going to get the full load today, I promise. Okay, so completely switching gears and talking about something else. Again, I'm very interested in international markets, promoting U.S. soybeans, supporting our U.S. soybean industry through increased markets. So this is a kind of a narrow angle on this, but we're going to talk about a 1% cap on foreign material on U.S. exports that has been imposed on us by China. So this came about before any of the trade wars came around. So once this is all resolved, we're still going to be under this new regulation of 1% cap. Okay, I'm going to talk just a little bit about an introduction, grain grading and Chinese imports. I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign material that we've seen in a survey that I do of our U.S. crop. And then I'm going to talk about an educational program that we're starting up in the Northwest Corn Belt. Okay, so importance of this, and you all know this, but I needed to do it for my own research. So where do soybeans go? You can see we've got 130, this is the previous marketing year. So we lost 137 million bushels of soybeans. Whole soybeans were exported from the state of Ohio last year. You can see that you're up there with some of the primary soybean exporters around the country. Obviously, these are going down the river and make up this piece here. This is the 1.3 billion bushels exported from the Gulf of Mexico. My soybeans go this way. So up here in Minnesota, where this little dot, here's the Dakotas. You can see how important exports are to a state like North Dakota. You'll also see an indication of the change of what happened. We lost 300 million bushels in last year. Our exports off the P&W were about half they were the previous year, and this is all because China quit buying soybeans. Okay? Down here, Gulf shipments were the same as ever. So we continue to ship out of the Gulf. That's supported your basis. That's why we're $2 below Chicago when we get out here. Anyway, enough editorializing. Here is the meal side. So if you wondered where the soybean meal goes, here's what the meal looks like. You can see Iowa. Even though Iowa is not an exporter of whole soybeans, they do have a lot of crush plants and they export a whole lot of meal. But there is enough Ohio meal here that you can fulfill quite a bit of this eastern seaboard animal production with the meal produced here. So my point here is that we talk a lot about, in my country, about exports and whole soybeans, but the reality is we're all very dependent on exports. So grain grading. So with all commodities, soybeans are basically priced and graded based on these USDA, FGIS grain grading standards. And these follow those soybeans throughout the world global market. Established in 40, last amended in 2007. Does anybody know what we lost in 2007? Something was deleted from the grain grading standards on soybeans in 2007. Is that right? Then there's two. There's one other thing that was left off of the grain grading standards in 07. Test weight. And now we're getting all this discussion about test weight. I don't know if anybody's heard this, but people are concerned that soybeans are losing test weight. So we have protein scare, and now we have test weight scare. But test weight doesn't equate to anything of value in soybeans, so I'm not sure why we're talking about it. But that's another aside. Quality standards are focused, these original and these important grain grading standards are basically focused all around very easily quantifiable traits in the soybeans. Basically, you take your soybeans to the elevator, they have to be able to evaluate these in a couple minutes and give you a number and give you a price for those. We're not able to do any high-level, even protein analysis. You're not able to do any kind of wet chemistry or any other things. To really define what the quality is, it has to be a very quick and dirty process. And some, that's me here, some argue that these standards are antiquated. My argument is, as a larger philosophy around soybean quality, is we're missing a lot talking about these grain grading standards. We're missing a lot when we talk about protein. Animals don't need protein, they need amino acids. We should be evaluating these products by amino acids. The oil's important, but the fatty acid profile of that oil is important. We're getting instruments now that are better able to measure these things. Ultimately, somebody's going to figure out where to find value. They're going to measure it, and they're going to identify those soybeans that provide them or the users downstream from them more value, and they're going to search those out. And some of this quality stuff will start to sort itself out. But anyway, I meet regularly with international customers, and I will say, this goes back to 2005, I've been going overseas meeting with buyers, and when buyers start complaining about foreign material in soybeans, it's an indicator to me that they don't have anything else to complain about. Okay? So it's that last thing, when there's nothing else to complain about, they complain about foreign material. But it is something that we have control over, and it is something that they value. Farmers, and you'll see this, take very clean soybeans to the elevator, but somehow they don't always get there. So the other issue of this, too, is that the Chinese are buying, for historical reasons, Chinese buy all their soybeans on the spot market. Prices fluctuate while that boat goes from New Orleans to Shanghai or wherever else. Depending on where that price goes, if that price goes down far enough, they have more reason to reject shipments and find a new one at a lower price, depending on their need and how that price moves. So there's an interesting dynamic in that the Chinese have some ulterior motives in identifying problems with shipments. This is one of my first trips I made to China. These guys from one of these Chinese inspection agencies gave me these pictures, and then they later sent them to me. This is 2006, I believe. This was a shipment that came out of Brazil, but this is a huge problem for us. We really have to avoid this, and I know this is going on, and I've done some things in Minnesota to try to get the word out about it, but we can have whole vessels, Panamax-sized vessels, rejected by finding seed treatment in those vessels. We know there's soybeans that are treated that aren't planted. They should be disposed of. But I know in some cases those get hit in the corner of trucks, or they find their way to the elevator somehow. But again, back to my earlier comment, the Chinese, if they want to find a problem to reject a shipload, they could. It wouldn't be surprising to me if they had someone down in this hold for half a day looking for red beans. And that could happen. But rejecting these shipments causes a huge problem. It causes the Cargills, Bungys, AGPs a big problem. But ultimately that finds its way back to the farmer. Farmer always ends up paying, right? So we have to avoid this kind of thing. Okay. You can always find FM in soybeans. Whenever I've been at the ports, they unload these shibs, we look at it, and we can basically predict where they came from. Okay, one of these is from New Orleans and one of these is from Brazil. Does anybody know which one is which? Left or, so US is left or right? Left? You're all wrong. It's the right one. These are US beans. Those lighter colored ones with all the crap in them, those are from New Orleans. The ones on the right are from Brazil. Do you think Brazilian farmers can do a better job harvesting than you can? No. The reason there's a difference is because the Chinese instituted this 1% limit on Brazilian soybeans years ago. So they've been under this whole time. They've allowed us to import soybeans into China up to 2% foreign material, number 2 soybeans. But, like everything, we chatter and we talk about a lot of problems we have in the U.S. The Chinese get wind of it. What are they really concerned about? Weed seeds. They don't want Roundup, HPPDs. They don't want any of these resistant weeds coming in their shipments. And so they've instituted now a reduction to 1% on U.S. shipments. Oh, I'm surprised, but we find cockleburs a lot. You know, that's one thing that I never see much around, but the cockleburs and corn are very common. Corn is also very problematic for us in shipments. It's one of the most common foreign weed seed that we see in shipments. The problem with corn is, unlike soybean, there's a lot of corn traits that are not regulated for export. And so again, and this goes well beyond China, these shipments go to Korea or elsewhere and they find specific corn events in those shipments, because that corn event is unapproved for import in that country, they can reject the whole shipment. So corn is also a lot of problems. Okay, FM survey. So I conduct a survey of the U.S. crop. I've been doing it since 2006. There's probably many of you send me a sample of your soybean crop in the fall. If you send something to Minnesota, that comes to my lab. We analyze those. We get 2,000 to 3,000 samples every year. This year we started looking at foreign material in those. We've been doing foreign material in these since I started in 2006. But we started looking for weed seed this year. So this is what the overall foreign material looked like. Because of this terrible harvest we had, our numbers were down. We only had 1,700 samples this year. The FM averaged 0.2% FM in those samples. Only 5 samples had greater than 2%. 27 had greater than between 1 and 2. So 32 samples out of 1,700 had FM above 1%. So, I mean, this isn't a perfect survey. Farmers go out, they collect a sample. They're probably not going to send me the crappiest stuff they have. They might even pick out some cockleburs or something. But this gives us an idea of what we're looking at. So 98% of the samples have foreign material below 1%. You can forget about my math here. The important part is about 25% of all the samples. So even though we got very, very low levels of FM, about a quarter of the samples actually had weed seed in them. So they're very, very clean, but there's still weed seed. So 25% of the samples contain weed seed. And we've only gotten through, this is pretty laborious. We have to go through and identify every species and count every one of these things, including all the amaranths. So this is what we saw. So we got ragweed. Obviously, ragweed's large. You can imagine how it can get mixed in with soybean, so in your combines. So ragweed, we really need to avoid harvesting through ragweed patches because those are going to end up with our beans. Okay. Corn is the second. Morning glory, pigweed, so amaranth species all together. We just combined them for this study. So out of, basically, this means about 3% of the samples, of all the samples, had amaranth in them. So it surprised me a little bit is you don't think of those little tiny pigweed type seeds ending up and going through combines and ending up in the grain, but they do. So it's important from a weed management standpoint. So far we've got 71 species we've identified. So in light of the new Chinese requirements, we've initiated a program in Minnesota to educate farmers. I'm doing this for partially self-serving reasons. I think there's a dual purpose in this, and this is why I mentioned it as kind of a bridge between my two jobs at the university, in that if we can help farmers reduce weed seed in their grain, that will help them reduce the weed seed bank, help them manage weed resistance in their own fields, and at the same time ultimately help us produce a cleaner crop. So we started by producing a video kind of giving an overview of the project. Ultimately, in the next few months, we're going to divide this up into maybe 10 2-minute YouTube type videos on various segments of this, all the way from pre-plant, planting, post-emergence, roguing out weeds, harvesting, storage and transport, all those different factors. But I'm going to show you a little video, and let's see if I can do this. Can you hear it?
Minnesota has grown into one of the nation's top soybean producing states, annually planting about 8 million acres of soybeans and producing over 350 million bushels. About 2/3 of that production is bound for export markets, primarily in Asia. Customers around the world are paying increasing attention to the quality of the soybeans they buy, including the presence of foreign material. Sanitary and phytosanitary concerns are prompting global buyers to focus on the amount and types of foreign material in soybeans they purchase. Weed seeds are of particular concern for buyers as they work to curtail the spread of noxious and herbicide-resistant weeds. The United States Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, along with Chinese officials, have come to an agreement on foreign material and phytosanitary concerns focused on weed seed contamination that went into effect on January 1st, 2018. The new regulations, which apply to both bulk and container shipments of raw, unprocessed soybeans to China, limits foreign material to 1%. Shipments containing more than 1% foreign material will be further evaluated for weed seed contamination. These deeper inspections open shipments to possible rejection at the port. Rejections will have significant costs for the seller and ultimately work their way back to the farmer. It's critical for the entire soybean value chain to produce clean seed and keep it clean all the way to its final destination. Local elevators sample loads brought into their facilities before soybeans can be dumped. State and federal inspectors have protocols in place to ensure that the terms of sales contracts, including levels of foreign material, are met. Those are all important steps in ensuring quality, but the process begins on the farm. A key to reducing weed seeds in harvested soybeans is season-long weed management. Understanding the weed species and level of infestation present in a field is essential. That requires scouting and management plans. Knowing which weeds are present helps farmers and their advisors develop management strategies to control troublesome weeds. University of Minnesota researchers and others strongly advocate that farmers start the growing season by applying a pre-emergence herbicide. Pre-emergence herbicides control weeds before they emerge and allow the growing season to start off with clean fields. It's vital that farmers rotate the modes of action in the herbicides they apply to maintain the product's effectiveness and reduce the likelihood that weeds develop herbicide resistance. If fields are particularly weedy, experts recommend not planting soybeans in those fields until populations are brought under control. In order to plant clean fields, it's vital that farmers start with clean seed. Commercial seed is typically cleaned before it makes its way to the farmer. Soybean seed saved on farm should be cleaned before it's planted to ensure that farmers aren't unwittingly causing weed issues. Agronomic practices can also help with weed management. Research has shown that, depending on the weed species present, planting soybeans early in the growing season can get them off to a fast start toward early canopy closure, which will help shade out competing weeds. With some weeds, however, a more effective strategy is slightly delaying planting to allow more weeds to be controlled with pre-plant tillage or burn-down herbicides. Planting in narrow rows also results in earlier canopy, which can improve season-long weed control. Once soybeans have emerged, scouting remains an important part of season-long management. Understanding which weeds are present and their biology can help determine the next steps. Factors like weed emergence timing, reproductive biology, and persistence can help in planning effective weed management plans. Utilizing integrated weed management practices is essential for avoiding the development of herbicide-resistant weeds and to encourage the buildup of any one weed species. Not all weed control practices are chemical. Manual techniques, such as rotary hoeing, cultivating, or even hand weeding, could be necessary and helpful in keeping weeds from producing seeds. In addition to farm fields, it's vital that farmers control field borders, edges, fence lines, and drowned-out areas. Weed seeds can be dispersed over great distances, so managing perimeter areas is an important management step in preventing weed spread. Mowing ditches or other unfarmed areas can keep weeds from producing seed. Weed management doesn't end with the growing season. Farmers can reduce the amount of foreign material in their harvested soybeans by properly setting all combine fans and sieves. Proper settings will keep pods, stems, chaff, and weed seeds from getting into the hopper without sending valuable soybeans out the back. Combines have the ability to spread weed seeds great distances. Running mature weeds through a combine can distribute their seeds over an entire farm and beyond. Since some weeds, like water hemp and Palmer amaranth, can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per plant, even one escaped weed can contaminate a wide area if the seeds are spread out the back of a combine. In heavily weeded areas, it may be best to avoid harvesting those spots altogether. Farmers should mow down particularly weedy areas in soybean fields before the weeds become mature and seed is viable. This will greatly reduce the number of seeds entering the weed seed bank and prevent weed seeds from being spread across fields. Even if weed seeds have been produced, weedy areas should be mowed down just prior to harvest. While this will not reduce seed numbers entering the weed seed bank, it will greatly reduce the spread of the seed through the field to concentrate the weedy area in upcoming years. This will aid with future control. In addition, mowing down weeds prior to harvest will eliminate these weed seeds from contaminating the soybean crop. From planting to delivery to the elevator, foreign material management is the farmer's responsibility. In addition to weed management, growers should regularly clean storage bins, augers, grain legs, and farm equipment to prevent the spread of weeds and cross-contamination. Farmers should pay special attention to when they change crops during harvest and transport. A primary contaminant in soybean is actually corn. Corn not only adds to the total foreign material found in soybeans, but identification of unapproved corn traits found in shipments imported into foreign countries can lead to rejection. Therefore, farmers should carefully clean combines when switching crops. Trucks, wagons, and carts should also be cleaned. Likewise, augers and bins need to be inspected and thoroughly cleaned when changing crops. The dual payback for careful weed management provides a long-term risk management strategy for both weed management and market access. With so much riding on soybean exports, it's imperative that Minnesota farmers do their part to ensure buyers look to us for clean, quality soybeans. This video is an early preview of a new project supported by the farmers of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Checkoff organizations in these states are funding a project to educate farmers about the importance of maintaining market access through harvesting, storage, and transport of clean soybeans. Look for more detailed videos throughout the upcoming year.
All right, thank you for indulging me with that. I know there's a lot of repeats regarding what I mentioned and a lot of things you probably understood from before anyway. But here's just one final slide I wanted to show, and then I can wrap up here. So I think it's important to remember this 1% threshold is not necessarily a bad thing for us. These are my parting thoughts on this, is that It provides us a greater level of parity with Brazilian imports. So this right away puts the impetus on us to be able to produce a crop that has the same foreign material as Brazil. And it requires us to maintain the purity of these through our U.S. channels. So farmers can produce clean seed. They can haul clean seed to the elevator. I think it puts a lot more pressure on the whole downstream system to keep those clean. So it also increases the value of U.S. shipments to other locations, because if you're in Japan or Korea that may not have had this requirement, you're likely to get cleaner seed because the big exporters in the U.S. are going to have to maintain kind of purity for all of their stored grains so that they have access to Chinese exports. And so farmers need to do all that they can to help reduce weed seed. So with that, that is it for me. I've ran up to my time.